On August 8th, the U.S. Office of Foreign Control, or OFAC, sanctioned the use of Tornado Cash, an Ethereum-based cryptocurrency mixer. That means it's now illegal for any U.S. person or any entity doing business with the U.S. to interact with sanctioned Tornado Cash accounts. It is the first time an open-source software protocol was listed as a Special Designated National, or SDN. The reason? U.S. authorities say the crypto mixer allegedly facilitated money laundering in cybercrimes, including those committed by Lazarus Group, a cybercrime group backed by the North Korean state. It is a watershed moment for the crypto industry and sparks the question, exactly how do authorities regulate code that is decentralized, controlled by no one? It has sparked community backlash as privacy advocates, including Ethereum co-founder Vitalik Buterin, chimed in to defend the mixing service. Some even called it a war on code. And the overarching questions are, in this age of decentralized finance, can code become criminalized? What does it mean for privacy in DeFi? How do we tackle the threat of cybercrimes in Web3? And can existing regulations be applied to evolving tech? This is Crypto Rising, where smart conversations happen. Since then, this debate has taken a whole new direction. A warning in just the past 24 hours from the U.S. Treasury Department that unregulated cryptocurrencies could pose a risk to the financial system. Welcome to Crypto Rising, everyone. Forkast's flagship event series, where today we explore the role of law and international debate post-Tornado Cash, and with more enforcement action, this time on a DAO, or decentralized autonomous organization, and a call for regulators to act before it's too late. It seems that innovation itself is under threat. I'm Angie Lau, editor-in-chief at Forkast.News. Welcome to almost 430 of you joining from 94 countries around the globe. This is truly an international conversation. This is where you come in, audience. This is live programming. Ask your questions. We will be answering them live throughout the program. You're going to see a Submit a Question tab on the right-hand side of your screens. Enter your name, your email address, question, and hit Submit. And I'll get those questions answered with today's panel. It is a pleasure to introduce to you our panelists for today. As the head of CCI, a global alliance advancing crypto innovation worldwide, Sheila Warren leads some of the most influential industry leaders in the world, representing Coinbase, Fidelity Digital Assets, Block, Andreessen Horowitz, Ribbit Capital, Paradigm, and so many more. Prior to joining CCI, Sheila Warren was the World Economic Forum's deputy global head of the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution and a member of its executive committee. At the forum, she founded and led the blockchain and digital assets team, and her pioneering policy work helped shape data and technology spaces. We have also Jonathan Crompton joining us. She's a partner at RPC in Hong Kong. And as Asia's lead for RPC's Cybercrime Protection Unit, Jonathan helps clients investigate, manage, and mitigate the risks associated with cyber attacks and advises companies on data protection and reporting obligations. It's great to have Jonathan with us. And last but not least, we have Wei Zhao. He is a finance veteran with 20 years of experience, who is now heading Philippines' leading crypto and mobile wallet, Coins.ph. Now, earlier this year, he acquired the company and completed a $30 million Series C financing led by Ribbit Capital. Wei was, by the way, the former chief financial officer of Binance. He's also a strategic advisor and investor in a multi-strategy blockchain investment fund set up by former Binance executives. But first, before we get to our panelists, a really huge thank you to CCI, Crypto Council for Innovation, a global alliance of crypto industry organizations, for unlocking this event series for free to this global audience. So let's get straight to it right now, and let's dive into this international debate. All right, first, Sheila, I want to start with you, okay? Because really, the date was August 8th, not even a month ago. Tornado Cash came down, the action from the U.S. Treasury. This story is not about one particular action but really about industry implications. You got the call, the bat phone lit up, as it were, and as head of CCI and your industry participants, and all the stakeholders, give us a blow by blow as to, the events that day and what it actually triggered internally as a debate.
Angie, I mean, what a week that was. So I have to just contextualize this a bit. I, as many folks in the crypto industry, was actually on vacation celebrating one of my children's birthdays. And I got the call, I took it literally from a hallway in a museum in New York. I was like hiding so I could actually hear what was going on. Immediately went and found, the issuance, read through it, and realized pretty quickly that this was novel. This was something we had never seen before, and it was going to have potentially very far-reaching implications. And so, as you say, the bat phone was ringing all over the place, and we actually convened on Twitter Spaces to figure out, like, what does this mean? How could this have happened? What is happening? And it was, meant to be a lull. Congress was in recess. Europe was on vacation, as it always is in August. And so no one saw the timing of this coming, let alone the nature of it. But to your point, it was unusual because it wasn't as if we hadn't seen sanctioned wallet addresses or things before. In fact, we had. And while those raised their own ripples and consternation around that activity, it's pretty standard activity. What was novel here, as both the video and as you just said, was the idea that code was being sanctioned. This was a wallet address that consisted of a smart contract. So as opposed to being identifiable to an individual or an entity or anything like that, this was actually a functional wallet. And the sanctioning of such a thing meant that, first of all, you couldn't pass anything essentially through it, to use kind of layman terminology, but no one was really clear. And to date, I will say, despite the fact that a couple of weeks ago, we did get some FAQs from OFAC that articulated some distinctions that are quite helpful. Things are moving a little bit in the right direction. Nevertheless, what remains at this time is a new wrinkle that we've not seen before, which is the inclusion of code, specifically of code within the SDN, especially designated nationals list. And again, the implications of what that might mean for a technology that is decentralized, that does, the point of some of this is to actually intermediate using a code wallet is actually, it's quite challenging. We're gonna have to see where we go.
And where we go is really what we're talking about right now. Jonathan, weigh in here. As someone who actually goes after responsible parties to right wrongs, how do you go after rule breakers in a decentralized world if no one is responsible? Your thoughts on what happened when Tornado Cash came down and your perspective there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that we need to look at the context here. And if you look back a couple of years, frankly, this shouldn't have been too much of a surprise. In October 2020, both FinCEN and OFAC issued advisories about the problems with ransomware payments. FinCEN issued a further advisory in September 2021 about the issues with ransom payments and cyber attacks. In earlier this year, I believe it was March, there was the Blender sanction. And where FinCEN really is coming from here, and OFAC are coming from, is they don't like cyber attacks. They don't like money being stolen from individuals. And so what they're trying to do is ramp up enforcement action that will prevent people from dealing with, in particular, state actors. The Lazarus Group has been named in particular in both the Blender and the Tornado Cash sanction. But if you want to see where it goes, I think the best thing to do is look at the FinCEN advisories. So the FinCEN advisory from September 2021 named specifically mixers, DEXs, and civic exchanges as entities facilitating obfuscation. So that sounds like a bit of a concern to the industry, and actually it should be. But as the cryptocurrency industry integrates more and more, it is going to have to play by the rules that everybody else is already playing by.
I think that, it's not that you're not playing by the rules. You're really clear. I mean, you're building out a product that must comply. Not only in the Philippines, but you're very clear on international regulations, certainly from your previous perspective at Binance as well. But what is the practical here? What is the ideal for an ecosystem that really knows no borders here? And so on one hand, you have, as Jonathan and Sheila expressed, enforcement action from the US Treasury, but at the same time, this is an ecosystem that is referential to so many regulators around the world. How do you keep up as an industry player?
Yeah, I think the key point here for us to take away is that I think crypto is becoming mainstream. It has basically starting to receive regulatory attention, I think, from one of the, I would say, one of the most important regulatory sort of financial, one of the most important financial regulators in the world right now, which is basically, like I think anyone from the financial industry coming into it, doesn't matter where you are in the world. I think like sanctions or US sanctions sort of observance, or UK sanctions or UN sanctions. These are sort of like one of the fundamental sort of like, I wouldn't say building blocks, it's sort of like one of the fundamental foundations, I think, for sort of the global finance today. And I think one of the things that we have to sort of acknowledge is that, the impact of crypto on sort of these financial, I say, foundation building blocks, or building blocks of sort of the foundation system, I think is coming under sort of attention. And I think that's why sort of we're seeing this, I would say, quite a drastic action in terms of, because I think what it sets here is, I think, less about sort of, sanctions. I think, pretty much every, even most major crypto players around the world sort of acknowledges that as a financial service provider, we have to follow sanctions. But I think here, it's sort of like, where is the line drawn between sort of, people-driven industry versus sort of, I would say, code-driven industry or code-driven protocols in this situation. And I think the US, I think, has always had kind of like a look-through. So like, doesn't matter what entity runs what businesses, there's always a person or a group of people behind it. And I think that's what they're trying to get to here. I think from sort of the rest of the world perspective, I think I would say the impact is probably far less so, especially for people that are like coins like ourselves who are already operating sort of in this regulated industry. I think the bigger impact are actually on the much more decentralized protocols. And I think that's where sort of gets at the core, of what crypto fintech, which starts off as a decentralized service or a decentralized protocol.
I mean, if that's the impact, Sheila, what is the fine line that must be drawn? It's not black and white. It's very, very nuanced.
I think it's just all of these things are so complicated, right? And I think the other bit of context to provide here, so we had a series of meetings with Treasury Department and with OFAC, one of which Brian Nelson actually tweeted about, and we brought some engineers to these meetings to explain kind of how this technology works, the direction of travel. We explained what dusting is, and kind of said, like, this is a challenge because you can basically dox somebody by dusting them in this context to, these agencies. And that is a huge challenge, and it's an issue, and it's not something you don't even have to deliberately engage with this protocol in order to have that happen to you, right? You can actually be within the sanctions regime without any intentionality on your part whatsoever, even any action. So all these things are extraordinarily complicated in our space. But what I think the other frame is to recognize that the industry also, responsible actors in this industry are very eager to make sure that these bad actors are not leveraging some of these opportunities to take advantage of them. I think in the case of Lazarus and North Korea, we saw the news today about North Korea, Japan, what's happening, all this scary stuff. And so I do think that the flip side of this is it behooves the industry to take those responsibilities seriously, those public policy goals very, very seriously, which of course we do. And that's why you've got, whether it's analytics firms, whether it's ability to read and explore, whether it's all kinds of different mechanisms for people to be engaging with. Now, in the case of Cash specifically, the interesting thing about this is it was used by a lot of people who were literally sending their funds to themselves. They were not in any way transferring to any other party or anything like that. They were simply sending their own funds to themselves. And to date, that is not possible. Everything's locked up until you get a specific license to actually complete your own transaction, or to kind of indicate that your use of this particular thing, this particular opportunity is not illicit, like all these kinds of things, or you can kind of get an exception in a way. That's what a license amounts to. But it's really, really complicated. And I think what this, I think to his point, like what this leads to is, as we see more innovation and people are experimenting with it, if you roll something into almost like think of it as a beta and it's out in the world, are you going to be held accountable down the line for that use when that use was to some extent experimental? You were testing out a new product. You were trying to see how it worked, right? That's all very innocent, licit, legal activity. And yet real people have real money stuck in this thing now that they can't get out. So it's complicated in so many axes in so many different ways. And our goal at the Crypto Council is just to try to explain, frankly, to both sides, why the public policy goals of OFAC, Treasury Department, FinCEN, why these are really important and things that we should take very, very seriously, because they're about all of our security around the world. At the same time, educating these agencies about how the overreach in some of these cases means that people that are engaging in completely innocent, harmless by anyone's estimation conduct are also getting caught up in ways that are very damaging, not only to the innovation curve, but also to those individuals themselves and their ability to engage in, it's not illegal, right? To hand a dollar bill to somebody else, right? You do that on the street, you do that in your house, you do it wherever you want to do it. Similarly, exchanging value in this way privately should be something that we are also trying to preserve, because I think that is a value that we should place importance upon as well.
And there are really big and good reasons for that. We live in a world that is not necessarily ideal in many spots of the world. There is censorship, there is persecution, there is war. And, this is a technology that is also applied there. Let's be frank about it. I want to introduce our audience to engage. And in fact, guys, we put out some polls, some feelers out there from our Forkast audience. I want to share it with this group here today and our audience. We asked our viewers in a poll on their opinion of Tornado Cash. And the majority, 42%, said OFAC overstepped its legal boundaries. Now, why is this interesting? Because opinions matter in a democracy, and policy is shaped by its constituents. I want to get legal perspective here. Jonathan, come in here with me. You deal with cybercrime in your day-to-day job. You say, somebody has to be responsible for code. But what is the dilemma here that regulators face? Again, when we live in a world in which constituents' voices actually do matter, how to balance this dilemma, mitigating risk, and then also to make sure that the innovation is allowed to live and breathe.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, Angie. And I think regulators are very aware of that, and especially regulators in Asia, where I am based, are very aware of that. The Securities and Futures Commission in Hong Kong has, for quite some time, been trying to implement a regime that doesn't stifle innovation, but works to protect the investing public. And that's really what the regulators are there for. And the CCI actually has done some really good work on Tornado Cash, and the FAQs that have come out from OFAC have made it clear that if you have been dusted, then they've explained how you can deal with that. If you have actually been sending money to yourself, how you deal with that to get a license, and OFAC have indicated that that actually they will, as a starting point, allow a license to be given for that. But the two ideas that have struck my mind as we've been talking is, number one, that there's an expectation of financial privacy. Well, if people have an expectation of financial privacy, why are they dealing with the most transparent asset possible? And therefore, is it really an expectation of financial privacy, or are they deliberately trying to hide where the money is going or coming from? The second point that really struck my mind was that the industry is trying to cooperate. Well, we know that a number of exchanges have policies not to respond at all to letters from lawyers who represent victims. And that, for some reasons, that's for very good reasons. So for example, they just don't have the staff to respond to all the letters they get, or they've just decided, they've taken a policy position that they will only respond to letters from law enforcement. But this is not the way that traditional finance operates. And as Wei says, as the cryptocurrency industry integrates, it is going to have to step in line with the way that some of traditional finance operates. And the regulators are trying to allow that whilst not stifling innovation.
We saw two very immediate responses. Circle, which is the creator of the USDC, the US pegged stablecoin, immediately replied that it would honor a ban against those sanctioned addresses. Then you have what happened at Coinbase, which is actually funding the 6 individuals who are bringing the US Treasury and OFAC in a lawsuit in fighting this enforcement action. Those are two very different responses, and both reflect the best intent of what we hope that the law will, provide in terms of some guidance here. But Wei, what are your thoughts as you are running one of the largest exchanges in Philippines? You're in this world. How do you think about sanctions and enforcement action from a business enterprise perspective? Are you playing ball?
Yeah, I think for us, working in the regulated world, like I said before, it's a foundation. Sanction compliance is a foundation of basically doing business. If you're interacting with traditional banking, if you're interacting with traditional e-money players, if you're interacting with US dollars or any other sort of major global currency, I think sanction compliance sort of it's fundamental. Otherwise, you're unable to do business, right? And I think, but what I find really interesting out of this whole less about sort of the action of the I think of the US regulators, because I think one thing that we're absolutely missing is actually I tell there's 2 things that I sort of talk a lot about when we're dealing sort of in the cryptocurrency space as a regulator. But we need 2 things from our regulators. We need both clarity and we both need certainty, right? And which are both completely missing right now. I think some jurisdictions handle it better. Some jurisdictions like the US, I think is in the works, right? How do you conduct a business? How do you build a business if there's no clarity on what the rules are? Right. And the second part is that how do you conduct a business even if the rules might change 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 36 months now, or but the biggest problem I think facing the US players is actually sort of it's here are rules set up in place basically for a technology from a different era, right? And then we still have to sort of imply what those rules mean for players that are building business on basically completely different rails, or building or basically the tools that even we're using today, I think to build a new industry is actually different, right? It's so and then sort of the access points, the touch points that's being provided by the blockchain is actually different. I think that's the challenge, and I think from the U.S. perspective, they're still using their influence from I wouldn't call it the bygone era, but basically from the last generation, right? Sort of this global enforcement of U.S. rules on players. That touches on sort of U.S.-based businesses, U.S. people, and U.S. money. I think that sort of level of strength is still there, right? And I think for international players, probably don't have to sort of follow it, but we still sort of it's one of those things from my perspective. I sort of keep track of it until it sort of really starts to impact my business, right? Yeah. But I think that's sort of what international players are looking at. But yeah. the really, really interesting part here is that the writers or the coder of Tornado Cash, which is I think the guy is based in Amsterdam or somewhere in the Netherlands. He's actually I think still being locked up to the best of my knowledge. I think by law enforcement officials. I think in the Netherlands, right? And I think that sort of explains the impact of the reach of the situation. And that's really scary, I think, for developers around the world. in terms of like, hey, I just wrote a piece of code and I put it online, people use it. It's useful. Do I have, like, if you're a coder, I don't know, name a country you're in, I have no idea what the implications of what I'm writing for sanction. But
it's enormously frightening.
But at least, what I learned about the crypto industry as a whole is that we move fast and we're highly iterative. And I think it just sort of now, I saw Sheila putting her hand up. Sorry, let me just finish my point here and then you can jump in. But it's sort of like, I do think that, over the last month or so, the entire industry has learned everything there is to learn about what OFAC means, and then what what country is under US sanction. And I think, as a coder or as a programmer or as a builder, you sort of start, you basically learn this, like drinking from a fire hydrant, I call it. I think this entire industry sort of, the reason why we build things so fast is the ability to learn and iterate is so fast. So I think it's not, it's just sort of like, hey, at least we know now, this corner do not go into, right? So okay,
it's hard to keep up.
Yeah, so that's why I think like it's almost like it comes back to sort of the regular, we do not have clarity and rules, and we do not have certainty what the rules are.
That's right.
I think that's why sort of everything's sort of on a trial by basis, including regulation.
That's right.
Pretty scary. Which is pretty scary.
No, it's scary. It's scary. Sheila,
I think it's interesting, right? Because we do have a kind of understood default principle in the United States that code is neutral, technology is neutral, the pipes are neutral. You can build something, people can do good things or bad things with it, and you kind of look at the behavior and you say what behavior is pro-social, what's anti-social, what's desirable, what is going to have penalties attached to it, and what do we either not care about or are trying to incentivize, right? But that's about behavior. And this is a departure from that. I think it's fair to say, like, this is a departure from the principle that code itself or technology itself has a fundamental neutrality that is benign, and it is that what you do with it, that is what turns it into something that can be malicious. So that's where I think you saw a lot of people getting very concerned and upset about this, particularly from the developer community around the world. And it certainly didn't help that you had a detention of an individual, who built this thing in the Netherlands. And I don't pretend to be any expert on Dutch law, but unlike the United States, you don't have to have charging papers. Like, people don't really know, what is he exactly being detained for? Is he being detained because he developed code, or is it something else? It's unclear to this day, to my knowledge. And so I think that that is causing some consternation. But what I think the lesson, and I think that this is exactly what Wade just said, is how do we understand that in a world in which some of this behavior is going to be intermediated again by code, there's not going to be humans at the center of all of the quote behavior. We almost have to define behavior perhaps a bit differently and think about how do we, as an industry, illustrate that code is code, that what is part of the technology and what is part of the kind of application layer. You want to divide it that way. And that is not as clear in crypto and in Web3 as it is in Web2 and in kind of the previous generation, right? So that's leading to some of, I think, this overreach that the poll picked up there, which is interesting.
And we also, it's perfect segue to another poll where we asked our viewers, who should regulate DeFi, decentralized finance? This is where it gets interesting, folks. 30% said the government should. 31% say the government and industry both should regulate DeFi. So mull on that a little bit, because we're going to break right now. It's not only tornado cash as it pertains to code and privacy. Audience, stay with us, because after this short break, another U.S. enforcement action, this time against a DAO, and putting all voting members potentially in legal jeopardy. This is one of the important debates in blockchain innovation today, when code and innovation itself is under legal threat. When we come back right after this short break, 90 seconds from now, let's talk about the role of the regulators in the rest of the world, watching very closely in Asia. See you right here on Crypto Rising in a short 90 seconds from now.
News is your gateway to all things blockchain, breaking down and breaking through the noise with the people who know it best and why it matters. We go to where the action is, from Asia to the world. Forkast is the most reliable source of intellectual discourse and insight that informs, educates, and bridges the gap between the blockchain industry and the mainstream. The future is being built, and Forkast has it covered. This is Forkast.News.
If you don't understand the future, you'll never see your place in it. Introducing Forkast Plus, covering all things blockchain, independent reporting, insights, and access from Asia to the world. We cut through the noise where technology, insights, and access meet, where smart conversations happen. Make friends with disruption. Forkast Plus.
Welcome back to Crypto Rising. Now, just last week, another U.S. enforcement action, this time against UkiDAO. This report from our chief correspondent, Joel Flynn, on the Daily Forecast. Take a look.
Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, has filed an action against the UkiDAO, and it could have far-reaching implications for the whole of crypto. It could yet become one of the most important decentralized autonomous organizations because of the rules it's accused of breaking. The CFTC has just fined blockchain protocol B0X and its founders Tom Bean and Carl Kissner $250,000. The regulator said they'd offered, quote, illegal off-exchange digital assets trading without registering and complying as a Futures Commission merchant. UkiDAO was actually included in this fine, by the way. That's because the CFTC said it was B0X's successor. Ownership of the protocol had been transferred to the DAO in August 2021, but the CFTC said it was essentially operating in exactly the same way as before. The agency took issue with Bean and Kissner, suggesting that because the DAO was in charge of the protocol, it was, quote, enforcement proof. The CFTC said, DAOs are not immune from enforcement and may not violate the law with impunity.
All right, well, there you had it. Okay. Sheila, Jonathan Way, let's go. Let's talk about it. Good enforcement action or overreach? Jonathan, I'll start with you.
DAOs raise really interesting questions because it's the same with Tornado Cash. We need to think these structures exist, and as Wei says, they were created maybe 150 years ago in some circumstances, but definitely 30, 40, 50 years ago. And what is a DAO? And just labeling something a DAO doesn't make it immune. I mean, is a DAO a grouping of individuals? Is it incorporated as a company? Frankly, if it's not incorporated as a company, the individuals are probably at risk themselves because they control a protocol and individually are taking decisions. It would be better to incorporate as a company so that there's limited liability. But I think what pervades this debate is the fact that code doesn't just appear. Somebody puts it there and decisions appear. At least code doesn't just appear yet. And regulators have been dealing with the people who put in place computer programs as code for quite some time, for example, with black box trading. And the financial regulators have made it very clear that if an entity, an asset manager, uses black box trading, it has to be responsible for the code. And it has to be responsible for the people who code the code. But law is not made by regulators. It's generally made by legislators. And legislators and courts are sprinting to try and catch up with an industry, like Wei says, is incredibly fast moving, incredibly iterative. And the only way they can do that at the moment is to apply these old techniques.
Sheila.
It's, again, there's some context here, right? So what made, I think, this particular timing of this action very surprising is that it was in the context of a bill that's up in the Senate Agriculture Committee that is focused specifically on this question of what is the authority of the CFTC. And that looks specifically at spot markets, digital commodities. Nevertheless, there was a lot of attention being paid on a question that would seem to have been almost front run by the CFTC a little bit in this action. And so there's a fascinating dissent by one of the commissioners, Summer Merchant, basically says, even if we concede that there is something that was done wrong here, how do we decide where to assign that liability? And shouldn't it be the case, I'm paraphrasing a little poorly, I suppose, but that, that legislators and policymakers have the way in, they have the ability to basically articulate the boundaries or framework around what exactly should be contained where and who should weigh in on what. And what's fascinating here is the idea, and also troubling, I'll say, is this idea that you can have, and I think this is Jonathan's point, someone started the project, right? There were some people, and maybe they did good things, maybe they did bad things, I don't know. They settled, read into that what you will, okay? But then you have a whole bunch of other people that came in later at a different stage that may or may not for me to say, have known what had happened prior to their involvement, that were a voting governance token, and suddenly are finding themselves holding the bag for liability for something that they may or may not have had any visibility into whatsoever. So it is a really fascinating theory and an analogy that's been thrown around, and this isn't exactly right for a variety of reasons, but it's what if every shareholder who voted in some fashion or put a proxy in was somehow accountable for the actions of a corporation or the corporation's founder, even if that founder had long left the company. It's also the idea that would you hold a CEO 20 years later accountable for actions taken by their predecessor 20 years prior? These are all questions that are relatively well settled in the law. And so this action does lead itself to the question, should that be different? Should the frame be different if we're calling something a DAO? Shouldn't the form factor matter? Shouldn't the form factor at least be analogous to other things we've seen before?
Wei, how do you feel about it when, this is really, anyone can be part of a DAO, but this has industry-wide implications, including right in your backyard?
Yeah, I mean, I come back to my point earlier in terms of like CFTC is an enforcement agency, just like OFAC, as we talked about before, is an enforcement agency. All they have is basically reference points of regulations and laws that was passed previously, right? I mean, they just basically take interpretations of what they had as in terms of their reference, and they're applying it. Right. And then to the best of their knowledge, hey, this thing has people behind it running it. And these people, no matter what organization that you call it, or these people run this organization and they have influence over this protocol. And then if this protocol, breaches in their mind, securities or commodities violations, then they're going to go after this group of individuals, right? And this group of entities. But what I think is really interesting about DAOs, I'm a history major, right? So I look at sort of like history. Like if you look at sort of like LLC laws in the United States, that did not come out until like the 1960s and 70s. It did not really get refined until the 1990s. Like the definition of what is a limited liability corporation in the United States on a global basis, what is a private limited company, and what is a public company. And that's sort of what we're struggling today, right, in terms of entity formation. Like, because right now you basically can't have a DAO and have, not only can you form a DAO, but you can actually have a DAO token that becomes tradable on exchanges almost like, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, if successful, right, almost right away, right? You can, and I think that's the sort of that's what regulators are struggling today. And I think it's really important then on the lawmakers to sort of like figure out, hey, this thing you can do, this thing you cannot do. Or worst case scenario, be like, hey, just follow the old laws. Right? You come out and just say, just hear the old laws, no matter what you are. Like, it looks like a chicken, sounds like a chicken, it's a chicken, right?
It's a chicken.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what it is. It's sort of like, it doesn't matter what you call it, right? So if it's a private limited company, you still call it a DAO. But what's really challenging here is like, I think is that, blockchain capital formation is global. Right, but we're still dealing with companies that are regional, and I think that's the biggest challenge.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
Like DAOs at the end of the day are supranational. What do they call it? Like supranational, more international organizations. Right, we don't really have any. We don't really have any, anything that talks about, hey, how do I want to? If I want to form an international company, how does that work? Right.
All right, I want to get.
I'll pause there. Yeah.
I want to get the audience because they're chomping at the bit. I've got like at least a dozen questions from the audience, and I want to start with this one. It's a good one. From our audience, what are the chances of legal challenges to the sanctions being overturned in the U.S.? And how likely to be successful would similar challenges be in other jurisdictions? But let's start in the U.S. Sheila, this is your bread and butter. All right,
Yeah,
this is why you get up in the morning.
I tend to think that
Yeah.
when it comes to our core regulatory agencies, litigation is a path that, it makes a lot of sense. While I understand the litigation path in this particular context, the context of trying to fashion these sanctions, I have to say there's a history in this country. I was a practicing attorney during the Patriot Act, and I remember full well the balance of national security interests versus privacy and civil liberties. Pretty clear those were not considered equally in any court. National security won out. And I think that would win out again, because the minute that the government can make the case that what they did was to preserve and protect national security or for the defense or these kinds of things, it is very, very high standard to kind of prove that anything balances that, and that was not the intention. That was not, what actually even happened in this case. For, that's not for me. That's clear. Security clearance way ahead of my pay grade. And so I do think that those lawsuits are certainly, I understand why they are where they are, but my personal view is that it's a very complicated thing to try to make the case that national security is not the priority number one of the United States government.
And frankly, it's a priority of basically every jurisdiction. Jonathan, weigh in here. We've got Hong Kong, Hong Kong and financial services goes hand in hand. International city for finance, trying to make its way in this new digital world of ours. Hong Kong recently launched its version of the Crypto Fraud and Asset Recovery Group. Your law firm has personally been involved in it. How, in your view, do regulators internationally strike this balance between protecting the retail investor while promoting the industry? And what is that trust level there?
Hong Kong's a great example because the SFC has issued a number of circulars, advisories, essentially, trying to explain what is and is not covered under the Securities and Futures Ordinance, and making clear what action it will and will not take before it takes it. And what has been very clear is that the SFC has not had the power under the SFO to regulate certain behaviors of the industry. And that is why the new virtual asset service provider regime that is going to be implemented is not under the SFO, it's under the anti-money laundering ordinance. And it will then empower the SFC to take actions that it has been taking under the SFO for securities and futures market players. But it was very clear from fairly early on that the SFO did not cover parts of the industry. It covered parts of it, but not all of them. And so the SFC has been working with market players. It had a sandbox and a voluntary regulatory regime. Regulators are trying, but it's a very fast-moving industry. Mm-hmm. With CFAR, what we're trying to do is get a conversation amongst all the industry players. So CFAR was set up in the UK last August, and we very recently launched chapters in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and the US. And CFAR stands for Crypto Fraud and Asset Recovery. And the purpose of that is to get together lawyers, forensic accountants, hopefully the exchanges, because they're an important part of the discussion, custodial companies, and really to talk about best practice and what we can and can't do and why. So for example, I mentioned earlier that a lot of exchanges simply just don't respond to letters from lawyers indicating that there's a suspicious transaction. That's a technique that lawyers use often in traditional finance. But in these conversations we've been having, it's become very clear that a lot of exchanges just don't have the manpower to respond to them, which is why they then fall back on, we need a letter from law enforcement. Well, that's fine. As long as we know that, we can go straight to the police and get the police to write a letter instead. So we're really trying to implement best practice and through that to get some increased trust in the industry and therefore aid adoption.
That is a great point. If there is difficulty in actually pursuing, bad actors from an enforcement level, from a agency level. It's almost easier to have a blanket rule or a blanket ban because it just makes it easier, right? But in truth, the industry actually bears a lot of responsibility. Wei, first at Binance, now at your own shop, as an industry leader, how are you thinking about participating in potentially, the CCIs of the world and the industry groups of the world to actually collaborate on what it looks like if the industry were to enact its own universal standards of enforcement? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to think about here. I think one, the industry as a whole, I think is drastically different today than I think when I joined in Binance in 2018. It's significantly bigger. The larger exchanges have far more resources. The regulators and the law enforcement agencies have far more resources. We were just integrating chain analysis, I think, at the end of 2018, and now it's kind of like a pervasive tool that pretty much all law enforcement agencies around will have access to. The cost of those to access these tools have come down significantly as well, as competition have entered into the market. We've seen sort of other type of forensic tools. So I think, here in the Philippines, I think we're still trying to we are working with our regulators quite closely in terms of educating them on the tools that we're using. I think to track, sanctioned individuals, to track, I think, what we call on-chain due diligence, on-chain transactions. And then at the next thing, I think the world sort of like the industry sort of has to come to bear is actually on the travel rule compliance. I think there's a variety of things that's coming down the pipeline that, to fit. I mean, I see sort of the crypto industry as like a fast growing, body of water that we're trying to integrate with this larger body of water. Right. And then the more, and I think what's going on, I think from the traditional sort of world, the DeFi world is that, hey, if you want to integrate with us, you have to follow sort of these things. Otherwise, we're not going to taint our water with your water. Right. Which I think is happening. Right. Because I think there's going to be I think the two ecosystems it's going to become much more integrated. But for that integration to happen, here are the things that needs to happen. I think it's very, we have to be responsive to the financial intelligence units of different countries that actually go after money laundering. But I think that money laundering aspect of crypto sort of like is something that I think the world has been talking about since the beginning of crypto. I think there's at least tools and there's actually practices that most regulated exchanges now follow, because I think that knowledge I think is already kind of set in, especially by the leading players. The new guys that are coming in, less so. Right, but at least, because I think some of the stuff that we're talking about today, like in terms of codes being sanctioned or DAOs being going after, I mean those are actually the later innovations, the recent innovations. I think that the regulatory stuff that the regulatory bodies around the world, especially in the United States, have sort of brought their attention to. That as an industry, hey, now we have to sort of take notice and figure out how we sort of adopt our business practices and adopt our sort of day-to-day operation to sort of meet those kind of regulations. So I think like just as a whole, I just finish up here. Sorry to take up your time. Because as a whole, like I said before, this is the industry moves really fast, and I think people in the industry I think are very reactive, right? I think as we see things happen, we react in real time. I think that's actually sort of the nature of this.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah,
the industry has to react in real time. Otherwise, you don't get the kind of adoption that you need at a retail level. Philippines is the second highest country in terms of adoption right now, according to Chainalysis. The reason is really super clear. 70% of adults in Philippines are unbanked. They need a better system. They have been ignored by the system that is in place. Okay, so then we say that the industry is paying attention. And on the other side of it is what happened in the last 24 hours. And Sheila, this is right in your backyard in DC, where the US Treasury came out and said, we are concerned about contagion. We are concerned about the spillover effect. To your point, Wei, that you just made, that the two worlds are increasingly becoming interconnected. And what the Treasury urged Congress to do was to act right now, because innovation, according to Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, quote, I'm going to quote her right now, innovation without adequate regulation can result in significant disruptions and harm to the financial system and to individuals. Okay, read the tea leaves for us, Sheila. What does this portend?
Well, I have to say, I'm not sure that it necessarily portends a lot, as dire as it may sound. And it's not that we haven't heard kind of similar pronouncements from senior officials before, quite frankly. The reality is that everyone is looking to Congress to act, and Congress is certainly very active and engaged in thinking about how to act, what is the right move, what needs to happen. But politics is complicated. So even with the tremendous amount of awareness of the complexity of this space and this industry, of the need to balance preserving the innovation aperture with consumer empowerment, education, and protection, even with that knowledge, how you move forward is complicated. I mean, for all the reasons we've talked about during this session today, it's really hard. So I think the call to action is certainly well received, I think, by many. A lot of us in the industry also say, look, we don't want to be, we're responsible actors. We don't want to be associated with people who are engaging in predatory inclusion or who are deliberately trying to scam people. Like, that's not what we're here to do. And we would love to see, some of those people disincentivized at a minimum, right, by the appropriate regulation that would be put into place. But again, the action to take is not as straightforward. So I think it is fair to say that there's a lot of activity happening. We are right in the middle of all those conversations in Washington. And I think it's going to be going into this new post-midterm cycle in the US, but also globally, it's going to be a one to watch. Let's put it that way. There's going to be a lot of activity going into this new year.
All right, let's get back to our viewers here. We asked in our final poll, how important is complete autonomy for them in DeFi, okay? As they participate in decentralized finance, how important is complete autonomy? And almost 60% consider it enormously important. So therein lies the issue, right? This is why people feel like they want to engage in decentralized finance. And yet the reality is this is the most transparent code in the world, and we can track everything, which means it's immutable. And that's the whole point that allows for the seamlessness of these transactions. But at the end of the day, the consumer wants that autonomy. And at the same time, the regulators also want to make sure that the bad actors are at bay. And in fact, also the consumers want to make sure that there's safety rails involved. Where do we go next? Wei.
Yeah, I think decentralized. I think like it's kind of like a misnomer. I think one of the funny things about crypto that I find is like what you call it from day one may not what it turned out to be. Like a stable coin, it's not a stable coin. It's just a collateralized US dollar at this point, right? And a DeFi is not really DeFi. It's just open finance. It's just that basically it's finance enabled without sort of middlemen. Right, I think it's basically automated finance or open finance rather than sort of like really decentralized. Because I think it's a lot of these organizations that run these decentralized finance protocols. It's not really a decentralized team. It's just actually still a centralized team that's actually building the protocols. Because one of the experiences that I had, over the last few years is that organizations that are truly decentralized is actually things move much slower. I just look at Ethereum, right? It took them, 4 or 5 years to really sort of get Ethereum 2.0 out there. But as a sort of like centralized organizations, still sort of develop things faster. I think for DeFi as a whole, the industry as a whole, it's going to be awesome. Just because, like I said before, you're going to have people from all over the world that can plug into the system without sort of the traditional barriers that they've had in terms of getting access to, I would say, because one of the things that we're trying to do at Coins is actually what we call crypto inclusion, like education, non-intimidation. I think it's basically, having financial access is actually one of the key fundamental building blocks. And I think what I believe is one of the fundamental freedoms that you kind of have, right? Financial access. And I think now with the blockchain technology, with sort of wallets, with stable coins, with different products being available on DeFi, you can actually access lending products. You can actually access trading products. You can access these kind of things that weren't really available to you before, depending on where you live. So I think that's the really key thing that I'm really looking forward to is actually bringing a much larger user base and bringing much larger financial access. On the other side of the coin is how do you protect these people, right? How do you protect? Because I think anytime there's financial innovation, anytime there's access to lending, there's going to be bad actors sort of taking advantage of users. And I think we're in this sort of like constant sort of like cat and mouse game. And for us,
that's right.
In the Philippines at least, we know who the regulators are, right? If there's any issues, people doing bad things, at least there's one party that the users can go to, which is our regulator. Yeah.
That makes sense. Jonathan, weigh in here. The penultimate question for you. How does Hong Kong deal with the cybercrime issue? And where does Asia rank in terms of leadership in crypto regulations?
It's a great question. How does anyone deal with the cybercrime issue? We've been talking about Chainalysis, and to put this into context, the situation is not getting better, it's getting worse. So Chainalysis, in its half-year report, had said that in the 6 months to June 2022, there had been $1.9 billion worth of crypto assets stolen in hacks. That compared to 1.2 billion the year before. So the problem is getting worse, and so it is important to. Crypto has great advantages, particularly with the unbanked. But like Wei says, how do you protect those people? Hong Kong has been taking a lead, Singapore as well, both great financial centers. The difficulty, though, is it takes time. And the industry has been calling for regulation, for laws. And I welcome judgments that come out that talk about whether a cryptocurrency is an asset or not, because it's only recently that question has been answered by the courts. But it takes time. And so if we take it all the way back to Tornado Cash, I'm not a US lawyer, but I actually welcome a decision from this challenge to see where the boundaries are. And that is unfortunately how the system works, that legislators, regulators, and courts, they take time. But certainly the MAS in Singapore, the SFC in Hong Kong, they are trying, they're leading, they're talking to industry, and they're trying to put in place regulation that works for industry, but also protects investors.
And that's ultimately the key. Sheila, as we wrap things up here, we started with Tornado Cash, then we talked about UkiDAO, and really it feels like innovation is under attack, or it's evolving. And it's evolving because more participants are coming in, and it's not just the developers anymore, the coders, not even just the industry participants. The participants now include us as constituents, and then also the regulators and agencies and policymakers who are reflecting a bigger, greater good. We hear two extreme cases always in crypto. On one hand, we can immediately help Ukraine on the ground, raise funds, immediately get to those in need, even before official aid comes in. And then on the other side, you have a hacker in North Korea trying to launder money and all the bad actors that exist. But this is a world where one cannot live if the other doesn't exist. So where do we go from here? What's the guidance?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, Angie, I'd agree with that, because the big difference, right, in those two cases is the Ukrainian government publicized very widely on Twitter and social media their wallet addresses. And then those were verified by independent sources and other people. They were confirmed by people from, Vitalik, other leading names in the crypto industry, and donations flooded in. So there was almost an abandonment of the privacy. Everyone knew who owned that address, right? And they were very motivated to send that support to catalyze the international response. On the other hand, the case you're talking about North Korea, privacy is pretty imperative. They don't want anyone to know, who that is and what's going on, apart from the other party that's sending them money to use for illicit purposes or value. And so I think what's coming down for everybody engaged in, and frankly, in financial services, is a reckoning where we're all going to have to decide, what does privacy mean to us? Where does it matter? When does it matter? Why does it matter? And that's going to be all the way up to regulators and policymakers and government actors and all these different kinds of folks, but also users are going to be faced with choices to make. And I think, I don't know if there ever should be only one option. There should be a spectrum of privacy options, and you may choose different ones depending on what it is you care about. It may be that sending something to yourself you care tremendously, and you want to use something like a Tornado Cash to make sure that the amounts you have, whatever it might be, are held private because that matters to you. Or it may be that you actually want to solicit, something like crowdfund something, and you want to publicize your wallet address. All these things are possibilities we should have in the ecosystem, but we're all going to have to come to terms and reckon with that as individuals and as a community. And that is something that I am very eager to see happen. And what I don't want to see is have a decision shoved upon us by any one agency or any one government's approach, but to say that we collectively have the ability to vote with our fingers, essentially, and decide what matters to us in that space.
And this is that platform. And this is why these conversations matter. These are the things that are happening in real time right now. And I want to thank you to our panelists for an incredible hour. Sheila Warren, CEO of CCI, Jonathan Crompton of RPC Hong Kong, and Wade Zhou, of course, of coins.ph. That is a wrap. I want to thank all our guests for their candid perspectives and insights, and of course, our partner CCI for unlocking this event series for free to our global audience. But you know what, audience? I really want to thank you. Joining from 94 countries around the world, what we're talking about really matters in every part of the world. And some of you have some of the most important regulatory perches across the banking, legal, and policy sectors. Thank you for joining us. It's this kind of conversation we're proud to host here at Forkast that we know you won't get anywhere else. That is a wrap today. And thank you, everyone. There is much more on Forkast Plus, our membership portal, where some of the brightest minds in this space depend on for the latest developments across Asia and the globe. And we also host those voices editorially. You're also supporting credible and quality coverage like this. Stay tuned for our next Crypto Rising event. For more, visit Forkast.News. I'm Editor-in-Chief Angie Lau. Until the next time, thanks for joining us. This was Crypto Rising.